All right, here we go. Mike, thanks so much for your time. It's good to catch up again after 8 years. I'm really excited about the podcast. Before we go into the questions, can you just give our listeners a little bit of background on where you are currently and your previous experience in strength and conditioning? And I'm sure everybody's excited to hear about that.
Thanks, Will. I'm the strength coach for the basketball team here at Florida State University. We just finished our 20th year here, and I've been a college strength coach since 1990, 91, I guess. And so 31 years of doing this. I've coached all over the country, a lot of different institutions. I was at Stanford before this, at the University of Miami, West Point, South Carolina, SMU. So bounced around pretty early. And then we've been here for a good bit now.
Outstanding. And so you primarily work with basketball players, or is it a wide range of different sports in the past?
Yeah, right now it is just basketball. It was not like that at all earlier, and that's because the conditions in college athletics have changed dramatically. When I first started off, there would be your typical college setup would be there would be a head strength coach, and he did football, and he had an assistant that helped him with football, and there might be a GA, and the assistant and the GA did every other sport. So it was so that's what I came up in, and so we trained everybody. A lot of football because that was the driving force of it, and then because I was frequently the assistant in those other positions, I was the guy also doing basketball and a lot of the other sports in those positions as well. So trained them all, men and women, every sport imaginable. And so that part has been a good experience. And now what's happened is the size of these strength and conditioning staffs have grown a lot in ways we never could have dreamed of. If you had told me 20 years ago that they would have 5 full-time strength coaches in college just for football, I would never have believed it. So it's a completely different animal than it was.
Do you think that I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, continue.
Do you think that working with a wide range of different athletes to begin with has kind of helped you now that you've found a niche or you've specialized a little bit more in basketball players?
I suppose it helps. Any sort of experience is helpful. The way we train people, we always have thought that we've always come out at it with a little bit more of the thought that your muscles are your muscles, and you get them stronger by just providing a progressive overload through their functional range of motion. And then if you want to go and play basketball with those stronger muscles, or if you want to go and play chess or field hockey with those stronger muscles, it didn't really matter. So we've always philosophically, from a training standpoint, have tried not to pigeonhole the specific type of training as to a particular sport, because we think that the training that we do is beneficial for everybody. Now, there's quirks to sports, but most of those quirks have to do with the calendar, the way that the year rolls with those sports, when the heavy competition is, when it's not, how that's interacting with the school calendar. And that stuff's an art, how to manage that sort of thing. And the more you do it with a particular sport, the better at it you get. So but it's been a blessing to train. I've made some really good friends across the different sports over the years, and I wouldn't trade that.
Awesome. And what are some of the qualities that you feel like in general that basketball players may be lacking in a little bit, especially when it comes to the physicality of things?
Well, I'm not sure. None of the players that come to us really have an extensive training background, and I don't fault them. I'm not sure it's even necessary, because it's possible that the strength training that you could receive could damage you. It could work against you, and so 90% of the players who come to us have very little strength training background or none. And I am absolutely fine with that. Take a blank slate and then teach it the way we want to teach it and bring them up through it. And so that part of it, it's not problematic at all. But with that said, most basketball players don't, I shouldn't even say this about basketball players. There's a misconception in the general population that athletes just sit around thinking about training all the time. And it's really, this stuff is really bad during the Olympic years, because the Olympics are always doing these human interest sob stories and stuff about people training. And so your typical person sitting on the couch watching this thinks athletes sit around thinking about training all the time and training all the time. In reality, most really good athletes never think about training. The only time they think about strength training is when it's their time to come and strength train, and then they leave and they don't think about it again, because it's just not a high priority on it. So for people like you and I, who, we found something in training that for whatever reason, it pushed a button in us, and then we spent years of our youth kind of mulling it over and thinking it over. And then you run that up against a really high level player who never thinks about training, and when you're young, there's a bit of a disconnect there. You're thinking, man, why doesn't this guy love training and think about training and talk about it all the time like I do? Well, the reason why is because they're really good at their sport, and they don't. And they were going to be good at their sport whether they strength trained or not. They've got the genetics to do it, and so that's the part of it that you're managing a little bit with high level basketball players, is their interest level varies, but only a few of them have a real high interest level in it. So you got to be able to engage them. You got to be able to meet them where they are with their interest level and their psychology of it. Not talk down to anybody, not talk past anybody. Don't bore them when don't have an interest level in it of something that you don't. Kind of try to meet them in the happy spot of where they are along their journey. So, but none of them come in trained. None of them come in anywhere close to their potential, and that's fine. We love starting from ground zero and going from there.
Absolutely. And for a program like yours, you are obviously able to see them quite often, right, throughout the year. What kind of what does a typical year look like for you guys in terms of training, and what are the thoughts that are going on as a strength coach? Like, do you have a full off season with them, then a preseason, then in season? What can you walk us through what it kind of looks like for you guys?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because we just started the summer program right now, and we have all of our players here in town. Now, what has happened that is different is the college governing body here in the United States, the NCAA, over the last few years has changed the rules to allow our sport coaches to work in a limited fashion, but to work with our players on skill development in the off season. So we no longer have a true off season like you would have thought about it 8 or 10 years ago, where the season ended in March, and then from April to September, you strength trained and played pickup. That doesn't exist anymore. So our players will start working with their coaches this week. And so we're strength training around that practice schedule constantly throughout the summer and constantly throughout the preseason. So there's not really a true off season in the sense that there once was. So now what happens is these guys will come back, and I've got two different groups. I've got our returners who have been through our program, and then I've got 7 or 8 new faces, and they go through what we call Repology 101, the study of the rep. And this is we teach it almost like a class. So these freshmen starting this week, they're going to be with me 5 days a week for the next 8 or 10 weeks. And it's not that we want them training 5 days a week by any stretch. It's that this is the one time in their career where I can carve them off to the side and try to put my brain into their brain and get all this stuff taught that I need to get taught to them, or at least that I feel like I need to get taught to them. So I have a long list of things that I feel like they have to be exposed to by the end of this summer. And so for the first summer here, the freshmen are going to be with me more frequently than they will be at any other time. And it's mostly because of all the things that we have to install. So then once they get past that and you get into the preseason, then most everybody's lifting twice a week after that. And that stays pretty constant year round. You know, it'll go to once a week during the season for the high minute guys. And we've got some kids that don't play much that like to train a little bit more frequently, but that part of it's an art, managing the volume and frequency. So,
and you call that Repology? Did I get that right? You said it's called Repology?
Repology 101, the study of the rep. Like if you were looking at your college courses, and you could take cosmology, you could take biology, you could take zoology 101, but here you're going to take Repology 101.
Love that. Can you give us one thing that you feel like, just so myself and our listeners get a better idea, what's one thing that you kind of emphasize in their Repology 101?
Well, it's two main things, and this is all we talk about 90% of the time, and that's the effort level and technique. So effort level, technique. The very first thing they learned to do Friday when we started was everybody learned how to train to maximum effort, how to train till they couldn't do another repetition. They all got to see it, they all got to experience it, and it was explained in detail of why they need to train that effort level, how their nervous system interacts with their muscles. So there's a reason for everything that we do. And when I teach it, that's the way we teach. I teach the way that I wanted to be coached when I was their age, and that was I wanted to know the reason for everything that we were doing. If there was a good reason, I was willing to do anything. But my brain didn't react to somebody saying, just do it because I told you so. And so I assume everybody else's brain reacts the same way. And that's the way I coach it and teach it. And so we take these guys from day one on some very basic, nervous system, interact with motor unit sort of stuff. And this is why now we're asking to train at this effort level. It's not because I'm a sadist or I'm a tough guy and I'm going to make you a tough guy or anything like that. It's because this is what nature demands. Nature demands that the effort level be of a certain point in order to provide the right stimulus. So we're constantly explaining effort. And then what I have found is that if you explain it well and you coach it well, it for most kids, it can be habituated. And you hear sport coaches talking about, we're always having to coach effort, or we never now have to coach effort. I find in my area, if I explain it well, I can and reinforce it a few times, I can habituate people to it, and the effort level stays where I want it to be. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is the technique. Now the technique hardly ever gets habituated. That has to be constantly reinforced. Even guys who've been in our program 4 years are always still cleaning up reps. It's just something about it that is hard to do in an unsupervised fashion properly. At least what we think of as properly. We have our way of defining how repetitions should be done, and we're always trying to train to that standard. And we're not always hitting it. Sometimes if you come in our weight room, it's going to look like the floor of a Mercedes or a Ford factory. Everything's just going to be precise and running perfectly. And then there's other times you're going to come in our room and seeing us train, it's just going to look like chaos. And so we're always the two pillars is effort and technique, and that's what we got to get driven home during the summer. So
right. And you touched upon that the rules have changed slightly, and now that there might be skill development that goes on. Did you say during the summer or during the off season? Like there's when there previously was not, right? Can you give us a little bit of pros and cons on what you feel like is since the rules are changed, do you feel like there's a lot of pros? Do you feel like there's a lot of cons? Do you think it's a little bit equal? What's your view on that?
Well, our view on that is the same view as the way we're my wife and I are raising our son, and that is we don't think in terms of utopia, we think in terms of trade-offs.
Okay.
Everything is always a trade-off, as the great Thomas Sowell said. There are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And so the trade-off is our skill development really, the amount our guys improve, the one thing Florida, well, not the one thing, but one of the things that Florida State really can hang its hat on is player development. So Coach Ham is great, and then Coach Hamilton, and then Stan Jones, and our other assistant Steve Smith, and then Charlton Young, who just left us and now being replaced by RJ Bosch. These guys are terrific skill development coaches, and so if you work with them as extensively as they're going to work with you, you can't help but get better, and you can just see it. So that's the upside of it. The trade-off that is, we don't have a true off season anymore where the players aren't running up and down the court, having a little bit of practice stress. And with that, I think we see a little bit more overuse issues. One thing that, and it's not just here, it's talking to my colleagues around the country. This practicing year round, we're all seeing a lot more foot and ankle kind of issues flaring up. Mm-hmm. So, is it 100% attributable to it? No, but anecdotally, it seems like it is. So those are what you're trading off. You're not getting a full off-season physical development, but your skills development is much faster than it was in the past. So.
Yeah, so it's about those trade-offs, as you mentioned. Can you give us a little bit of insight on your philosophy of physical training, strength and conditioning? Who are some of the people that you looked up to in the past? Who are some of the people that you followed? And how do you go about assessing your athletes when they first come in?
Well, when you ask a question of what is your philosophy, this is the point where I quote my friend and colleague Mark Hasanovich when he would be asked something like that. He would say, "Well, I don't have a training philosophy. Our philosophy is based on physiology, but I do have a coaching philosophy." And so now I steal that kind of tongue in cheek. And if you say it the wrong way, it can come across as being kind of aloof or sarcastic. But in the spirit of what he's saying there, what I would say is our training philosophy, meaning I know what you mean by it. I just took this down that side road to make a point, is based on the fundamental precepts of what has become termed high intensity training. Now, high intensity training has a lot of interpretations, which is great because there's not one way of doing it, but there's also a lot of misrepresentations of it, and there's a lot of misconceptions of it. And later on, we could talk about what some of those possibly are. But within the realm of high intensity training, what you're trying to do is you're trying to train as hard as you can in order to stimulate muscle fiber to have to grow stronger and bigger. And then realizing that if you train at the effort level that we're talking about, if you have no experience in this, you're quickly going to find out that there's a limited amount of exercise that you can do at that effort level. And it's far more limited than you maybe had initially suspected. And there's a little limited amount of frequency of how often you can train. And you're soon going to find out it's a lot less frequent than you expected. So this high effort level of training requires relatively brief sessions and relatively infrequent sessions so that you can recover from it. So in a nutshell, our training is high effort level with moderate volume and a lot of recovery in order to allow recovery and progression. That's our training philosophy. Wrapped up in that is the things that we do, we want them to be joint friendly. So we're not only training for performance, we're training to help protect our athletes. And so in that case, we can't be doing things that are dangerous to our athletes, that are injurious to joints or even put joints at risk. And so consequently, we use protocols that are not only high effort level, but they are moderate in force. We're not popping on joints, jerking on joints, slamming down weights, dropping things, exploding on things, and jamming the hell out of our joints in order to create effort. We teach our players how to create high levels of effort in a controlled fashion so that they're not destroying their joints in their process. So the elevator pitch is high effort, a lot of recovery, relatively brief so that you can produce that high effort in a joint friendly environment, a lot of recovery, and an emphasis on progression. Now, I think the second part of your question was influences. Am I right on that?
Yes, yes.
The biggest influence on me initially when I was young was the writing of Ken Leistner. And how did I come upon that was my experience of coming into training is just like everybody else, just an average small town athlete, and you wanted to strength train to get better. And we trained in our youth pastor and football coach Phil Vaughn's garage, and that was, our experience with it. And then sometime late teens, I got this idea in my head that since powerlifters look to me to be the strongest people on earth, then they must know something about strength training. And so I started subscribing to Powerlifting USA magazine. And so this would have been in the early to mid 80s. And I would read it, and some of that stuff made sense. But there was a guy writing in there by the name of Ken Leistner. And Ken wrote he just wrote powerfully. And the way he wrote, the way he said things just resonated with me. And he wrote from a high intensity training perspective as it applied to powerlifting. And so that was my entryway into it. And of course, now this is 15 years before the internet. So trying to find information on something like this, you had to be pretty motivated. And so from there, you start trying to get into, well, who else thinks this way? You literally go to the old bookstores, the old B. Dalton or something like that, walk in the fitness area and try to find information. If you could find a single person who had a copy of the original Nautilus bulletin, it was like finding a treasure, because this stuff was not readily available, wasn't easily available. But so Ken Leistner was the original impetus for trying to learn about high intensity training. Then once you kind of open the door, you're kind of in the club at that point, and everybody reads Ellington Darden. His son Tyler Darden is helping me as a student intern here at Florida State right now. And then you start learning about the strength coaches of that era, Dan Riley and Mark Hasanovich and people like this. And then you start finding out some of the bodybuilders of that time, Mitzer and people of that, some of the super slow guys. They kind of got a bad rap on some things, but they really brought a degree of technical expertise to exercise that was sorely needed. And if you get around one of these guys that mastered that stuff, and you pick their brain about exercise technique, you're going to realize just how little you know. And so in that area, Rob Serrano in Virginia has been a big help. My good friend Steve Murray, who's a strength coach at Toledo, he and I worked under Tim Swanger at West Point. Steve's the finest strength coach I've ever been around in terms of getting players to just love being in the weight room, love the environment, teaching it, coaching it. Fantastic strength coach. Chris Zimmerman, who gave me my start at Southern Methodist University. There's a lot of people, but the fire was lit by Ken Leistner, and he sadly passed away a couple years ago. Yep. And when I started reading him, I went and I was going to subscribe to his newsletter, The Steel Tip, just as he was starting to end it. And so I bought all the back issues, and I still have them. I still treasure them. I highly recommend everybody to read those. If for no other reason that the writing is entertaining, you're not going to be bored by any of it. So
Awesome. And when I spoke,
and one more,
Yep.
one more on the science side of it. Ted Lambertides is the resource. He wrote and edited the Hard Training newsletter, which kind of filled that gap when Ken stopped the steel tip back in the late 80s or in the early 90s. Was a wealth of information. He's a good friend, and he's still a wealth of information. He's a walk-in library and encyclopedia. You ask him a question, and he's got this deep file in his brain and a fast retrieval system, and probably has seen and read every human physiology study that's ever been put out there, and he has them all at his fingertips. And so he has been a tremendous resource from the academic, scientific side of things. So.
and last time I spoke with you, which was a while back, you mentioned that everything that you did, at least at that point, was all one-on-one training. Did I have that right? Like back then?
Yeah.
Is that still the approach that you take? And if that's the approach,
yeah, we try to do it that way, but it can't always be that way because we're running so much bigger numbers. You could do that when you had 10 or 12 guys, but we're now running 18, 19 guys on our team because we run a big walk-on team. And so now what happens is when they've been in our program for a year or two, I can kind of deputize them and they can help me train guys. And so nobody's ever training unsupervised, but the ability for me to make it just me and that person in that room, it's difficult just because of the numbers that we're running. And so I've got players, and Tyler right now is helping me. So the supervision is very, very close to one-on-one, but it's not always just me and that other player.
And do you feel like that was the best approach and that you got the most out of the players at that time with the one-on-one training?
Yeah, back to trade-offs, So you're getting the most supervision, and you're getting the which I believe is critical. I think supervision and motivation is the key to the strength program. You're losing a tiny bit of the juice that can happen when you got a couple guys in there training together, and but then you get bigger numbers, and then it's not the juice of a couple guys training together. It's a bunch of guys goofing off, and so somewhere in there is the sweet spot. But the highest coach to player ratio is always what we're going to be trying to get to.
Excellent. And how do you go about tying what you do into the weight room with what they do onto the court to make sure that there's the most transferability on the time that you spend with them in the weight room?
Help me understand what you mean by transferability.
So basically, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned that you guys do, just like all of us do, is general physical preparation. Is there any more that you guys do that may be a little bit more specific in terms of the movements that they will see on the floor, in terms of, I don't know, like a lot of programs might do quote unquote agility training, movement training, stopping, starting, accelerating, cutting, all that kind of stuff. Do you guys also incorporate that on top of the high intensity stuff that you guys do?
Very, very little. And and the reason being is they're with our coaches year round. And so they are getting professional coaching instruction year round on the court. And so me going out there and setting up some cones and saying, hey, let's go touch some cones with a kid that's averaging 18 points a game in the ACC, him touching cones isn't going to do anything. He's wasting his time, and I'm wasting his time, and I'm burning energy. And he's got Stan Jones over there who's got 40 years of coaching experience and can take him through, the mechanics of the things he's got to get better at. And so we do a little bit of that stuff in the preseason. We do run a preseason conditioning program. We call it sand pits. We got these sand pits that we run in. It's kind of our thing. It's kind of our identity, but it's 3 weeks out of the year. It's not a lot of what we do. And more than anything, it's about kind of forcing, it's a group cohesion sort of deal. It's really early in the morning. and we're going to run in the sand pits, and then in there we'll incorporate some agility with our sprint conditioning. But we don't because of the nature of the way we're structured in terms of skill development with our coaches. Me just running guys around cones and touching cones, and when I say that, let me back up. I don't mean to disparage any of that. It's just that we don't have to do that because our coaches are taking care of all of that. And so for the most part, our guys are on the verge of overtrained year round.
Yep.
So I don't want to add anything that isn't absolutely necessary, because even the things that we're doing that are absolutely necessary are digging them into a hole, you know.
Right.
So what nowadays I am managing fatigue year round, where in the past I was managing fatigue for 4 months. So now, so let's get back to transferability in terms of other things, like specific exercises, things like that. We never speak in those terms in the weight room, because we want them to understand that what makes strength training different from basketball is that it is different than basketball. In basketball, you can't get high tension, time under load, however you want to phrase it, constant tension, sustained effort, high intensity muscle contraction. That's why you come to the weight room. You come to the weight room to get those things, because there's something unique about strength training that you can't get from sports. And so we do not want our strength training to look like sports. If sports is what allows you to develop maximum strength, then there's no reason to run a strength program. But they don't. Sports doesn't allow you to reach maximum strength, because it's high speed, low tension activity. It's not high tension activity. And so we don't want to confuse our players, and we don't want to confuse ourselves in terms of trying to mimic things in the weight room. We want the weight room to be the application of overload through the functional range of a joint that is constantly progressed up into your genetic potential. You can't do that if you're trying to simulate sport activity in the weight room.
Right. And so basically you're giving them what they don't see on the court. Is that right?
Exactly. That's
right.
precisely it. There's no way that you're going to overload your groin adductor on the court doing it. Even if you're doing 15 minutes of continuous defensive slides, you're not going to overload those muscles the same way you're going to overload them if I take you through one set through our Medic's groin adduction machine.
Right.
And then you get into muscles that barely get. We're going to train your neck here at Florida State.
Yeah.
We're going to train not just your calf, but your plantaris. We're going to train your tibia. So we're going to train your rotator cuff. We're going to train your scapular retractors. And you can't do these things. We're not just push and pull. We're going to push, pull, but we're also going to curl, extend. We're going to pronate and retract. And these things have to be addressed with direct resistance, and most of the time they need to be addressed with direct rotary resistance, like you see in a leg extension or a leg curl, because those muscles, there are muscles around those joints that only get activated in the fully contracted position. And so that those joints need to be isolated and trained through their fullest safe range of motion in order to get as strong as possible. And you can't get that through just squatting. You can't even get it through just leg pressing. And I got the best leg presses humans have ever developed. And you can't get it through running and jumping on the court. And the best example of that is, well, I got I've had lots of players come through here, and you see guys who are just freakishly strong in different exercises, or at least in terms of the amount of weight they can use, they seem to be freakishly strong. Very, very few of them have anything even close to appreciable quadricep strength when they come in. I mean, jokingly weak in their quadricep. And why is that? Because all the running and jumping they did, it's never isolated the quadricep. It's all been through the hip and hamstring. Guys come in with huge, hamstrings, great strength in their hamstrings. And, I've got 12-year-old girl who could use more weight on leg extension than a lot of these guys when they first come in, but they all really improve fast. And that's the next thing is these muscles, once they get isolated and trained properly, man, they get strong fast. And you see people who can almost, triple the amount of weight they're using in six or 9 or 12 months. And the only way you can make that kind of gains is if those muscles were already in an atrophied state to begin with. You don't triple the amount of weight you're using on an exercise if the muscle was in a healthy state to begin with, but you can if the muscle was atrophied to begin with. So we see this over and over again in muscle groups that don't get isolated either in the weight room or definitely on the court. Groin adductor, low back, neck extensors, rear delt, rotator cuff. And so we're comprehensive in the way we're training, but we don't ever think in terms of transferability, at least not in terms of mimicking exercises. There's a transfer of being stronger, but that's another topic.
And I remember talking to you years ago, and it just blew my mind when you said that, because when you isolate muscles, you then see sometimes you might see better results on the court because you're isolating that muscle, even though when they're on the court, the muscles work integratedly. So it's almost like you isolate to integrate. Could you kind of say, is that kind of the philosophy there?
No, I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
We isolate because that's what nature demands. Now, if you want a stronger quadricep,
yep,
then you do leg extension, and then you can also leg press or squat and do a compound joint movement with it. But if you go and you do a proper set of leg extensions, especially if it's on a well-designed piece of equipment, we can talk about the vagaries of that later. And then you immediately went and you did a compound, whatever it is, a leg press or a squat, and you did both those things to failure. Let's use the old school term, the failure. The failure meaning not to be able to do another repetition. Mm-hmm. Okay, you've done everything that you can do to stimulate that muscle. If you give it time to recover and you come back, you're going to be able to use more weight the next time. Now, you've isolated that muscle, and that thing is then going to get stronger. Muscle development is going to happen. Your integration, to use your phrase, it's almost going back a little bit. It's almost immaterial to what we're doing in the training, because we're training based upon what nature demands. The nervous system and your muscles demand high level of effort, and they demand high tension in order to stimulate the growth process, and then they need time to recover in a progression to allow the process to occur. But what you then go and do with that, whether it's to play basketball or read a book on the beach, that's up to you. And so the integration is a skill development. And this is where you got to have really good coaches, and which is what we have. And skill development, the problem on the skill development side, especially with young coaches or inexperienced coaches, is that they think almost anything that they do on the court transfers. And that's somewhat true at low levels of play. Like if you took, a basketball duffer like me, and you told me just to shoot, 5 shots, at 5 points around the arc, and I did that for half an hour every day, I would get better at shooting, and it would transfer to some degree. But at the high level of play, that sort of stuff is a very little transfer. You got to learn how to shoot with a hand in your face at game speed, with everything coming at you, and So that's hard enough to recreate in practice as itself. There's no way you can recreate that in the weight room. There's absolutely no way. And if you could, you wouldn't have a good strength program with it, because you'd be back to high speed, low tension activities, which is what you get on the court. So you keep the two separated, and then to integrate, you got to try to get your skill development looking like competition. You got to try to create competition sort of conditions. And this is you're getting on a little bit of a hobby horse for me, because you're getting into motor learning stuff. But there's a lot of ways to fool yourself on the skill development thing, because you can set up agility drills. And I'll give you an example. Every year I prepare guys for the NBA Combine. We don't do a lot of these NBA Combine testing things in our own day-to-day life, and so I put them on the lane slide agility or something. And the first time they'll do sometime, let's say it's 13 seconds or whatever it is. Then after a week, I've cut 2 seconds off of their lane slide agility, and I look like the agility coach of all time. And I can puff up my chest and pretend like I've taught this guy, I made him a speed guy. Look, I'm a speed guy now, agility this, and everybody needs to come and buy my agility book. But really all I did is I allowed this really high level athlete a bunch of reps to get better at one specific task that's not going to translate to the game, but some dummy's going to look at it and think it translates to the game and say, "Yeah, look at his agility time. It's incredible." And then he's never going to do it again, and he's going to go back to practicing basketball. But because we didn't do it for the 3 or 4 years he was here, in 2 weeks I show massive improvement in something that in reality is not basketball. So basketball is not track and field. It's not a 100-meter dash. You have to react to people. You have to react to situations, and you can't do that unless you are doing it. And you can't really. It's really hard to recreate it. And so this transferring thing is the best information on this that I could give you, and I'll send it to you later if you want. Is a couple of motor learning specialists out of San Diego State, and their basic conclusion with a lot of this motor learning stuff is you got to create, in terms of what actually transfers in athletics, in open skilled athletics. I'm not talking about closed skilled events like rifle or shot put, but where you're having to react to people. The thing that transfers the best is to create a lot of randomness in the drills. And coaches don't like to do that, because you don't get the instant gratification of seeing the guy go from shooting 12 for 25 around the arc to 17 for 25 in a week, and making you feel like the shooting coach of the year. You start introducing true randomness into it, and it's a struggle, and the players are struggling, the coach is struggling. But later on, that's what transfers to the game. And so I'm sorry to go on a rant, but the transference thing it's a big deal. Specificity of skill is a big deal. If coaches can get their heads around it, everything becomes a lot simpler. Once you kind of get your head around the way your nervous system actually learns skills and retains them, and then can display them later, then the way you're going to set up your practices, the way you're going to bring players and develop players along, it's going to become a lot simpler for you. You're going to save yourself a lot of time. You're going to save your players a lot of time. You're going to save your players a lot of wear and tear. You're going to save yourself a lot of frustration. So sorry to go on a rant with it. It's just a little area that's in my wheelhouse. So
no, it's definitely a big passion of mine. I'm constantly asking, like, as a strength coach, I always try and question myself in terms of like, if what I'm doing is actually what's best for my players. And when you were listening to you as strength coaches, we kind of give them what they don't have on the court or the field, right? Because they're getting all of this stuff on the court. So then it's up to their technical coaches, technical, tactical specialist coaches to be able to create that random variability, whether it's block practice or random practice, to be able to transfer those skills and movements onto the court. Do I have that right, Mike?
Precisely.
Exactly. Got it. Now,
that's the way we do it.
Exactly. As the strength coach, you arguably spend the most time with the players year round. How do you go about building relationships with players? Because what strikes me watching videos and stuff is that you do that uncommonly well. And you take a different approach to maybe a lot of other coaches do. Mike, when I'm developing buy-in with my players, do I necessarily have to be, rah-rah, loud, aggressive, alpha in order to get their buy-in? Or is there another way to do things?
Well, wow, that's a very insightful that's a very insightful question. I think I'm pretty good at it. I wasn't always very good at it because when I was young, I thought I could just steamroll people, but it's because I was stupid. I didn't understand human dynamics, and I didn't have, I guess, the phrase that people use nowadays is like interpersonal IQ or emotional IQ. So one thing that's helped me immeasurably is we've had a couple coaches come through here, Dennis Gates and Charlton Young, who were outstanding at this. Their ability to read a room and read players, and I can't do it like they can, but I learned watching them. And the first thing I would say for anybody in the coaching thing is be yourself. Don't be a fake. Don't be a phony, because young people, they'll sniff that out right away. So if you're not the rah-rah guy, don't be a rah-rah guy, because it's going to come across as fake. What I jokingly tell our guys, so they put I let them put their music on when they come in and play, and they'll say, "Hey, Coach B, you like this song?" I'll say to them, "Listen, there's nothing creepier than the 54-year-old guy who pretends like he knows all the rap songs." So I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to pretend to be them, because they don't want that either. You might think, but they don't. So be yourself. Like what you do. Work your job. There's nothing, the old saying, there's nothing more motivating to a man than watching his boss work. Work your job. I'm going to be in the trenches. I'm going to load damn near every weight in this room for every player and stand there and count every rep. And be an agreeable person. That's kind of that Jordan Peterson thing. You don't have to be nice, but be agreeable. Be somebody wants to be around. And if you're always sarcastic, and I got that side in me too, I have to cut that part out. The only way you can interact with people is to kind of belittle them, it's just tiresome. Nobody wants to be around it. So I'm always trying to catch guys and find something to encourage them about or compliment them on, whether it's a haircut or their shoes or something, that just make it so people don't. The first thing to do is quit doing the stuff that makes people not want to be around you, and that can be a hard thing, especially when you're young. Man, I was like that. That just do stupid stuff, and you don't know why it's not working. And then I try to meet people where they are, and I try to find a connection. And when I was younger, I was able to make that connection through a lot of talk about music or pop culture, but I can't do that now. So the funny thing is, for me, is I do it through food, like what type of food that they like. And I'm a really good cook, and so I'll make their food and I'll bring it into the weight room. And so you can come into our weight room, there may be ribs in there one day, or chili, or sausage dogs, or something of that nature. So I try to find a connection with people, be genuine, don't be fake. The rah-rah stuff, most people get tired of it. I don't know how much of it you've been around yourself, have you? Will, I lose you. Will, I think I may have lost you there.
Sorry, Mike, just lost you over there for a second.
Where
Perfect.
we leave
So,
off that?
no, sorry. So I lost connection there for a second. Basically, so as a coach, one of the things that I always ask people is how much guidance can you give them while letting them figure something out as opposed to giving them the answer directly? Because at the same time, it's their journey, right? It's a journey that they
Right.
need to take, and you might want them to figure some things out on their own. How do you go about balancing those two things?
That's a great question. I don't, because what happens in my environment is I actually have pretty limited time with these guys. So you mentioned earlier that I probably spend more time with these guys than anybody else in the program. That used to be the case.
Okay.
But with the year-round practicing, that's not the case. And so when I got to impart information, I got to do it at that moment, because they may not either be in a receptive learning mode at that point. The question may not come up again. I may forget. And so, but your question reveals a great insight on your part, and that is you can't just keep spoon feeding people and without retarding their development. And so the perfect example of that is I got married and had our son late in life. So I'm 54 with an 8-year-old, and I don't spoon feed him everything, because I know I'm going to have time to backfill anything that isn't, working at the moment. So with him, I find my moments to let him figure it out. I find, what he'll tell you, he goes, "Am I supposed to have agency here?" I said, "Yep." You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to be walking around like somebody with no agency of their own life without anything in it. So when you're dealing with personal relationships that are like at the family level, and you've got the time and you can kind of string stuff out, your insight is spot on. In my relationships with our players, I don't always have the time to let them kind of figure it out. We just got to get to it. So.
Makes sense. Well, Mike, you've been so generous with your time, and you're such a humble guy, even though you're so accomplished and you've been doing this for so long. And again, anybody doesn't know Mike, I reached out to him maybe 10 years ago when I was first coming back to Hong Kong and getting into the industry. And he was so kind, and he gave me a bunch of time and a bunch of encouragement. And I'll always remember that. Mike, where can people find out more about you? How can they contact you? Because your training methods are awesome. You have so much experience. Where can they get more insight on you and contact you?
Probably email's the best. I'm a little bit of a dinosaur with some of the technology stuff. So just email me at mbradley, MBRADLEY at fsu.edu. And we'll try to get back to you. Don't always get back within 24 hours, but usually within a couple of days. So.
Well, again, Mike, thank you so much for being on the Basketball Performance Podcast. I'm really grateful for your time, and I'm happy that we were able to catch up.
Great catching up with you too, Will, and good luck with your venture there.
Thank you so much. Just hold the line real quick, Mike.